Hey everybody, let's talk about the pros and cons of using grids with magazine layout and look at how grids, especially column grids and modified grids, really help establish solid composition and good placement for text and images so that they can play nicely together. So let's show some examples and talk about it. This is a pretty typical magazine spread. You have an article that needs to be displayed on the pages. This might be a multi-page article. This just happens to be one spread. You've got some graphics that go along with the images. You've got titles and pull quotes and other things that go with it to kind of illustrate what the article is about. What's nice about this layout is it has a couple things going for it. There's some nice contrast between the two pages. You have kind of the lighter color on the left, darker green color on the right. You kind of have a nice back and forth between the two color schemes. They're kind of like, warm, no, they're like dark, light, excuse me, light and dark. So it's a nice little contrast. But the color is coordinated. So we have shades of green that are used in this and pretty good combination of values from a light to a medium to a dark. So it's pretty solid and that kind of works together. I also really like the way the white shape kind of breaks up the edge of that green illustration. Now, the illustration and the graphics are placed strategically, so there's room to put a title and room to put the written text. A lot of times if you focus on the photography and you forget about where to put titles and things, you back yourself into a corner. Now let's apply a grid to it and just kind of analyze why it works. So here you've got a typical column grid where you have two columns on each page, and there's an extra space given here on the right-hand page for the pull quote. I like how you have kind of the top third for the title on this side, and then extending onto the other side, you see that whole page was dedicated to the two columns of text. It's also important to recognize that the baselines line up. The baselines from these paragraphs match the baselines on page 2. That's really important for typesetting so that you pay attention to how your text boxes line up. There's also, I think, a good leading, meaning the line spacing is good. There's a decent gutter width between the columns, and the text has full justification. It's not ragged edges, it's left and right justified. It fits neatly into the text columns. All right, let's look at another one. Here we have one that didn't have a lot of text to go with it, but it also had some interesting geometry in the photographs and space for a title and a description. And I think what's interesting is this article is about these photographs as much as it is about anything else. And so the geometry and the architecture of the photos really, I think, informed the designer on what they were going to do with the items and how they were going to arrange them. And it would take some time, I think, to sketch out and plan out how to use diagonal lines and play with the photos in a way to determine this kind of arrangement. But if you know ahead of time how much text you have, how much space you need to give that text, you could start to piece something like this together. So let's apply the grid to it and see what happens. So it's nice the way that the diagonal lines were arranged to be parallel, or at least kind of parallel, to the lines in the background photograph, that watermark picture that's kind of in the back with that crisscross of that skylight. You also have things that line up with each other. These picture boxes get sliced and the photos are presented in an interesting way. But notice how the width of the column of text and the width of the photo boxes, or the photo frames, are the same. That's a visual consistency that they've maintained in their design. Then, out of contrast and a need to have a title, they gave themselves more space in a larger size to fit the title and the description on the right-hand side. And so, although this is a geometric design, it's kind of organic the way it probably developed. It may be hard to plan something like this. You might just start with some shapes and start fitting it together and see if the puzzle comes together. Let's try this one. So here you have one that's pretty much a typographic design. Picture isn't very large. It's just a goofy picture of Joseph Gordon-Levitt. And they played with the typography of the title. And they used that contrast to emphasize different words and make something interesting. So it wasn't just a boring, God, he's got it. It's God, he's got it, you know, in terms of visual emphasis. Also, there's kind of a interesting way that they broke the line here and added that paragraph of text. You can see these things kind of spaced out, but there is an underlying grid where these things line up. So you can see how the edges of the H, the S, and the I line up with the edges of the picture box or the text box. You have little cues here where lines of the D and the L line up with the H. The edge of the D kind of hits that O on that Joseph. This guideline on the T lines up pretty strategically with his face. And the base of the IT really lines up with Joseph Gordon-Levitt, so that baseline is consistent. And then the way the he's just kind of fits into that little spot underneath the I. So these are just little visual things that they've done to make things fit together in a nice way. Let's take a look at another one. All right, this I think is another typical magazine spread design where you have kind of a splash page where you're going to have the introductory photograph, then the start of the article, and then there's going to be a few more pages following this layout that the designer is working with. What I think is really cool about this one in particular is the title was made to interact with the photograph in a unique way. Whenever you can do something like that, you can create something special, I think. So they figured out a way to make that photograph and create a clipping mask around these photos so that you could get the text to fit right in there. And they used an interesting typeface. It's kind of a thick, bold sans serif font, but it has a little bit of irregular line weight. So it looks almost, I don't want to say cartoony, but it doesn't look quite precise like an engineered font. It looks a little more casual. And I don't know if there's a underlying influence there, but it feels like it fits in size and scale to what they want to do with this, this page layout. The other interesting thing they did is they took the two-column approach here on the text boxes and the introductory paragraphs, but they then went ahead and tilted them. And that also gives it a little bit of whimsy, I think. And so this, I believe, all of this, the yellow, the font choice, the tilt of the text boxes, doesn't that just kind of play into whatever this photo's about, where he's standing in a little rubber ducky pool? I mean, that says business at play. There's something going on here. And by tilting the text, they've also broken one of those text rules. And so things are a little bit off, but they're not quite scary or dangerous. They're just kind of fun. So here's a grid of what that looks like under the hood. Pretty consistent in the titling, and it's good the way it spreads across the two pages. They've very clearly defined the subhead, and then this diagonal arrangement works for those two sideline text boxes. Pretty cool. Okay, another one. Okay, here we have a scenario where the illustration is selling the article. And so they really want to give that a full page treatment. And they have enough room to you know, encapsulate the text on the right-hand side. And I think this is really useful. It works in web design as well, where you have a nice beauty shot that kind of catches your attention, tells you a little bit what the article is about, and then what follows is a look to the right, especially reading left to right to see the text information. Now, the way this illustration is working, it breaks the page boundary a little bit, spreads to the edge. I really like how the illustration style matches the text style here. So the illustration is a little rough and has broken quality. It's a little distressed. So is the type. And that really ties them together. Another thing, this little dashed line element that is found on the illustration was repeated and comes into play and interacts with the text. I think that's really nice too. Then the subhead, the title, they use that font, but then you get into a more normal, traditional serif typeface for the paragraph and the legible text in the middle of the article. So this is a good harmony between the illustration and the typography. Let's see what the grid looks like. On the left-hand side, they really didn't have to worry too much about the columns, but on the right-hand side, they did give themselves a central column and aligned everything in the center and full justified the text, and so it kind of fits. Has a nice balanced view between the bold, bright illustration on the left and the text information on the right. All right, let's take a look at one more. So here you have what might even be just considered an advertisement in a magazine, not necessarily a written article. There isn't a lot of text here. It's pretty much just the name, company information, phone number, etc. And it's selling kind of a lifestyle. And this is letting the pictures kind of tell, but actually, Freudian slip, sell the story. And that's what we've got going on. What is nice is they did use a typical, picture box, but they tilted them slightly. So you have a little bit of a diagonal line. And that really goes with, I don't know if this is the logo, but it definitely goes along with the title font. This is the logo, XYZ Clothing Company. And so everything is parallel, and that makes a very nice, pleasing angle. So if I add a grid, we can see really what's going on. Even though the corrugated metal in the background doesn't follow the diagonal lines, the posture of the guy does. Look at how his arm just really kind of fits in that diagonal spot based on the same tilt and turn of those picture boxes. That's nice. Other things line up. Spacing is consistent between the boxes. The framing elements are really uniform and have a similar gap between them. These horizontal lines between the picture boxes line up with the text in a very nice and pleasing form. And so this is another one that maybe what they did was they had the logo and they had the basic diagonal grid laid out, and then they had to actually probably vector out all of those lines and picture boxes to make sure that they were exactly what they needed. Now they could probably make one of these boxes and do a little segment and duplicate and kind of put it together. But you can see how there's a real thoughtful approach here to the geometry, that the page design is locked in and it's consistent and it's logical and it looks like it matches. And that's a nice structure that they gave the page layout, all based on that underlying invisible grid. So if there's any takeaway from this, it's that grids are good, but you don't have to be just boring square grids. They can be a little bit irregular. But most of all, you want to make room for the text. And don't be afraid of white space or breathing space. As long as things are mathematically similar, the lines are aligned, your text is going to fit in place, and it's not going to feel like it's out of place, because we visually, subconsciously see the spacing, and we can recognize when something is in proportion and when something is out of proportion. All right, so hopefully that gives you some ideas on how to approach a page layout and how to further use your grids and guides to deal with more complex text working with photography. All right, so thanks for listening. See you next time.